Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is industrialization in the postbellum period. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those keywords at the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to the larger historical significance as well as to each other. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we last left off, we're discussing this postbellum period. Again, this is a series of about 5 lectures here that all take place in that post-Civil War period. We talked about Reconstruction, what's going on in the South, Southeast. We talked about going out west in our last lecture. And this lecture begins a series of 1 of 3 that will talk about what's going on in the North, Northeast. And of course, this era is known as industrialization, or the second round of industrialization. And so this is all overlapping at the same time. Now, in the mid to late 1800s, the U.S. underwent a series of developments that made it the premier industrial nation in the world. As we're going to see, there were many reasons for this. In fact, one of the main reasons, technology. But the thing is, that's usually what most students think. Technology, yeah, USA. But the reality is, we had much the same technology every other nation did. In fact, we weren't necessarily even the leader in technology at this point. More substantial reasons for this include things like abundant resources. This might be one of the most important ones. Yes, we have technology, but we have abundant resources. Remember, we have a vast country that we have now taken over all the way to the West. Now we talked about that. We were restored to the Union after the Civil War. We have all these major resources that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Compare that to a place like England, who was also technologically advanced and ahead of us, industrialization. But they are going to quickly run out of supplies, and they have to rely on colonies to get more natural resources. The U.S. didn't have to worry about that. Second big advantage besides technology, but besides the natural resources, was a cheap labor supply. Industrialization was built on having a cheap, expendable, imminently replaceable labor supply. In addition, we had a growing population that population was not only good for labor, but for consumption. You can build all you want, but you need people to buy it. You need consumers. Growing population. And we start seeing a number of innovations, not just technology, but business and manufacturing innovations that make it more easily, make it more quickly, make it more cheaply. So let's start with new technology for a minute here. New technology. One of the biggest things of new technology was steel. The thing was, steel's not new. Steel's been around for thousands of years. The ancient Chinese were able to make steel and make some of the best swords in the world back millennia ago. But what was new in the 1850s was the ability to create large quantities of steel. By the 1850s, a new process known as the Bessemer Process was discovered, which allowed mass production of steel. Now, why is this important? Well, steel is lighter than iron, and it can support 20 times as much weight. Why is this important? Well, if you're going to build a skyscraper and build upward in major cities, think about any major city, you have skyscrapers, right? Well, using iron beams, which was the previous technology prior to the 1850s, you could only go about 3, 4, maybe 5 stories tall before the iron beams would collapse under their own weight. But steel is much lighter. And therefore, now you cannot build a 5 or 6 story building. You can build 20, 30, 100 story buildings using steel beams instead. In addition, it can support 20 times as much weight, which again, if you want to build a skyscraper that tall, you have to support the weight of a tall building or a bridge. You have to support the weight of a bridge that's crossing a vast river like the Mississippi River. And then there's the fact that it can last 20 years versus 3 years. Think about this for a minute. Think about railways, right? You're building iron railroad tracks. Every 3 years, you got to replace the tracks. They're breaking down, disintegrating, which will cause accidents. The train will run off the track. It'll kill people. Which means by the time you finish the railroad line, the Transcontinental Railroad, you have to immediately go back and start replacing track. Well, if you're constantly replacing old track, there's no time or money or resources to build new track. In other words, more railroad lines. But if you replace that track with steel that lasts 20 years compared to 3, now you have the resources, the manpower, the time to build track in new areas and build a much more developed railroad structure. Now, I mentioned the Bessemer process. What is that? It's a very simple, profound, the reality is complicated in reality, but the simple version of this is that you superheat iron to the point it's melting. And then you quickly put it into a casing and you blow air through it. When you blow this air through it, you're able to blow the impurities out of it. Now, Henry Bessemer gets the credit for this. He was actually a Brit. However, an American also discovered this by the name of William Kelly. But ultimately, the patent went to Henry Bessemer, so he gets the credit for it. So again, the way you do this is remove the impurities by pushing air through molten iron. Which, by the way, fun fact, in order to create molten iron, it's almost 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The oxidation process raises the temperature and keeps it molten. You blow the impurities out of it, and now you can cool it back down and mold it into steel, whatever you want, whether it's rails or beams or whatever you want to build. This is a relatively quick conversion process where it used to take a Chinese man back centuries ago all day to make one sword. The Bessemer process takes the process from an all day to make a sword down from iron to steel in 10 to 20 minutes. Yeah, you heard that right. 10 to 20 minutes from convert iron to steel. So what does this mean? Well, it allows now, so statistically, in 1878, the U.S. was producing 732,000 tons of steel. That's a lot of steel. 732,000. By 1900, just 22 years later, the U.S. was not producing 732,000. It was producing 10.2 million tons of steel, paving the way for rapid proliferation of railroads, paving the way for skyscrapers. And we're just getting started. The second major improvement was petroleum. Oil, right? Again, is like steel, petroleum is not new. Oil is not a new resource. We didn't just discover it. But what is new, what made it an industry, is that in 1859, a driller by the name of Colonel Edwin Drake in Pennsylvania basically found a way to tap the oil reserves underground in what you should notice looks like an oil derrick. By using pressure, by using the process of going up and down on each side, they're able to reach these untapped reservoirs of oil deep beneath our ground. Again, the United States is one of the largest holders of oil reserves, even though we now import much of it from overseas. So again, oil is not new, but the process of extracting from the ground, of course, is new. Why is this important? Well, oil is important for all kinds of things. Kerosene for lamps, for heat and light. If you want to have machinery, and the Industrial Revolution needs machinery, right? Machinery needs lubrication. And of course, around the same time, we start developing the beginnings of the internal combustion engine, which needs oil and gas to run on, which will again fuel the Industrial Revolution. And of course, if you live in Houston, this becomes a number one industry because in 1899, spindletop was discovered and oil began to boom for the city, leading Houston to become the fourth largest city in the country. All because of oil and the need for oil for all parts of our country, whether it is industry, whether it's military, whether it's just the automobile later on. So we have steel, we have petroleum. On the good side of things, this is going to fuel the Industrial Revolution. It's going to fuel the industrialization of our country and help us become number one in industrialization. The downside to it, of course, is pollution. All of these things, oil, petroleum, steel, fuel industry, but it comes with great environmental degradation. Coal mining, logging, industrial waste, we're going to see a massive increase in pollution in our country. But that's a story for another time. We'll postpone that for about 100 years to the 1970s. What else fueled this rage? Well, all these resources would speed up industrialization. But again, technology and invention were at the heart of this revolution as well. How do I know this? Look at the stats. In the first part of our history, before the Civil War, we are at only 36,000 patents issued between 1790 and 1860. But in just the 40 years post-Civil War, the era we're talking about right now, this overlapping period we're talking about right now, over 500,000 patents are issued. What does that mean? Well, we are speeding up the innovation by inventing things. In fact, we actually created something in a new phenomenon that I like to coin as we created the invention of inventing inventions. What do I mean by that? Well, invention became an industry in and of itself. Small-scale individual inventors were a thing of the past. Instead, they were replaced by invention factories. Research labs devoted strictly to, inventing more inventions. Nowadays, we call them R&D, research and development. Every major corporation has one. But in the 1880s, 1870s, this was brand new. People like Thomas Edison, we all think, oh, he invented the light bulb, good guy, right? But he's the one that, besides the light bulb part, he helped to systemize the process of invention. He set up, yes, Edison Electric Light Company. But not only did it produce light bulbs, it provided a warehouse space that hired people just to create things. This was creating a bureaucracy of inventions, or as I say, the invention of inventing inventions. By the early 20th century, every major company, manufacturer, people like Westinghouse Electric, people like General Electric, GE, right? I'm sure you've heard of them. Every one of these major corporations has a separate building designed just to pour time and money into discovering new technologies to make their products better, to innovate. If you think about it, think about any major company now. There's Apple or Google. They all have R&D departments to create new things. Now, of course, this is all well and good. We have supplies, we have these resources, we have this technology, but the United States is enormous. And just as important as these new inventions was transportation networks. Now, we already discussed a little bit of this in our lecture on the West, in our last lecture, right? Railroads are extremely important for crossing the country, but they become extremely important for linking our country together, both on a national stage and interregionally. By the 1870s, the United States had an extensive network of railroads. In fact, in 1860, we had about 30,000 miles of railroads. So on the eve of the Civil War, we're at 30,000 miles. By 1900, we're at 200,000 miles. Remember, we're changing from iron to steel as a result of our Bessemer process, and now we can build more and more railroad lines. Think about it, from 30,000 to 200,000 miles of railroad lines in just 40 years. We also had another innovation, steamships. Steam-powered ships were vital because they allowed you to sail upriver, right? Between 1870 and 1890, thanks to steam-powered ships, the value of American exports tripled. American industry went international because it wasn't just internal through railroads, but internationally through steam-powered ships. In fact, steamship lines were actually one of America's first major true big businesses. So we can transport. We also need other things like communication. Because if you want to communicate across your country and have business across your country, you got to be able to communicate, right? And so technological, yes. Transportation, yes. Communication, yes. By 1844, a man by the name of Samuel Morse, you see him pictured there, he will develop a code system of dots and dashes to send messages via electrical wires between cities. The telegraph becomes extremely important for connecting our country. Telegraph lines were handling 63 million messages a year. In fact, there would be a telegraph line, steel cable, again, steel, notice that would stretch from the eastern seaboard of the United States all the way to England. Yes, there's a telegraph line under the Atlantic Ocean. That really happened. And before you ask, you have a really big spool of telegraph line, the cable, and you just start dropping out of the back of the ship as it crosses the Atlantic. That's how you do this. Now, then this got furthered even quicker in 1876 when Alexander Graham Bell will successfully invent the telephone and transmit the first spoken words over phone lines. And of course, following his invention of the telephone, he will create a gold mine of a company known as the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. The American Telegraph and Telephone Company, aka AT&T, which will become another one of those America's first big businesses, furnishing business and government with communications via telephone. Now, for all these things, I told you we need innovation, right? Innovation in business. And we start developing a new business model. Because up until this point, it basically was, hey, you have an idea, you have a business, you have to do it by yourself. Well, that was fine before the Civil War, when everything was small time. But now we're talking international business, we're talking big time multinational companies. How do you do that? Well, you need, first of all, capital. So one of the new big things that developed was called investment capital. As the demand for land, buildings, machinery grows, so does the need for investment capital. These new industrial systems had enormous startup costs, and no one has that money just lying around. They need banks. And therefore, investment capital come from these banks. Prior to this, it was just from the companies themselves. But as banks and financial institutions began to grow, this new system known as commercial banks, investment houses, insurance companies, the New York Stock Exchange, these are all brand new things because you need commercial banks to make commercial loans. You need investment houses that will just front you the money so you can start your business. You need insurance companies to prevent the loss in case something bad happens, like a fire, an earthquake, a flood. Insurance companies are born. And of course, we need to regulate all these things to make more money, so the New York Stock Exchange, which needs the telegraph and telephone to communicate messages from city to city to make sure that prices are regulated. Then, these big businesses have money now, but they're too big for one person. Because the way it usually worked was, hey, I have an idea, I'm a business owner, but when I die, what happens to the business? So what's birthed next is the corporation. The creation of the corporation was the idea that big business could not survive under single owner or just a partner. Instead, the idea of a corporation is to get a group of owners together under a single entity to act as an individual person. And they're not one person, they're a corporate group, right? And this corporation has several advantages. Number one is it can raise large sums of money quickly. Because it's not just my money, it's not just your money. We can sell stock. We can convince the masses of people that we have a good idea and you can invest in it. So you can sell stock or shares in your business to help raise money quickly. Not only that, corporations are great because that way if someone dies, the business doesn't end. It just the rest of the group takes over and keeps right on going. It also creates limited liability. Owners no longer have a personal responsibility for corporate debt. They also have no personal responsibility for the workers themselves, because the corporation is essentially a nameless, faceless group of individuals, of capital. It separates owners from day-to-day management. And by the time we get to the 20th century, 1900, corporations account for making more than 2/3 of all US products, which means corporation became the way of the future. It became the method. Producing 2/3 of all goods produced are produced by corporations, which means they have limited liability. They are disconnected from their employees, which we'll talk about in our next lecture, which creates its own problem. Speaking of labor, these corporations can't run themselves. They need cheap, expendable labor supply. And of course, we see this take place and it grows exponentially. In 1860, we only had about 4.3 million workers needed. By 1900, we're up to 20 million, a 5-fold increase. Now, who were these laborers? Where did these laborers come from? Well, obviously, US whites. True. We would have some African Americans. Yes. But at this point, fairly no numbers. One of the biggest suppliers is new immigrants. They were coming along looking for their lot in life, looking for a better life from other countries. Now, some were seasonal migrants that were from Mexico, some were seasonal migrants from Europe. The idea for most of these people who came over here as immigrants was to come over, work in the factories, and then go back home and create a better life for themselves. But between 1870 and 1890, over 8 million immigrants arrived in the United States seeking work. By 1914, we're at 14 million. The thing was, though, was where they're coming from. I mean, immigration is not new, but what it was new was where they're coming from. Yes, Mexicans were doing this, but most of them were coming from these new places in Eastern Europe. They were seasonal, they come, they work, they hopefully go back home is what the US wanted, what owners and corporations wanted. Somewhere between 25 and 60% of immigrants did return home. It became, the mentality was, oh, these are great, these are perfect workers. They come, they work, if they die, oh well, and then they leave. We get new workers that are cheap and expendable. But here at home, the majority are domestic workforce. The majority are rural Americans, 11 million in total, who will migrate to cities between 1865 and 1900. And they will get the better jobs and better pay than immigrants because they know the ropes. They speak English already. They can read and write usually. And therefore, they become largely those in charge. Again, there's about 300,000 African Americans also who will migrate north and find work in the cities. So again, we mentioned in the Reconstruction lecture that most African Americans stay in the South. We know in the last lecture in the West that about 30,000 did become exodusters. And now about 300,000 will move into the North to find jobs, usually low-paying day laborers. And they start forming new enclaves in black neighborhoods in northern cities. But, so what were these big businesses though? So we talked about the labor force, we talked about this rise of big business and this new style of business, this technology involved. But who were these businessmen? Who were these quote-unquote tycoons, these captains of industry? Well, we'll come back and talk about that in our second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.